He did not believe in miracles. He believed in numbers. Isoroku Yamamoto, card player, battleship gunnery officer turned aviator, Harvard student, naval attaché in Washington, was not under any illusions about the United States. He had seen the steel mills, the assembly lines, the oil flowing as if from the Earth's arteries. He understood what happened when those numbers were turned into ships, engines, and wings. If a war against America could be won at all, it had to be won quickly, before arithmetic woke up and walked. That is why the first months of the Pacific War move with such velocity. Pearl Harbor is a shock meant to buy time. The same logic drives the raids into the Indian Ocean and the dash toward Port Moresby. Every move is a gambler's double down, because the longer the game lasts, the worse the odds become. The Imperial Japanese Navy of late 1941 and early 1942 is superbly trained, courageous, and technically sophisticated. But it is also living on borrowed time. Yamamoto knows it. He has said as much to colleagues in quieter rooms, couching it not as pessimism, but as realism. The only path to something like victory is to break American will early, to seize a perimeter so large and so fortified that the United States chooses negotiation over a years-long climb. Fast forward less than 3 years, and the sky over the western Pacific looks like the arithmetic he feared. Carriers, big ones and small ones, steam in groups that stretch to the horizon, their decks stacked with aircraft whose cowlings wear serials like running totals. By dawn, flight decks are alive with motion. Ordnance crews move 500-pounders and 1,000-pounders like they are part of the deck, hoists rising and falling with the rhythm of the ship. Aviation fuel smells sharp and sweet. Hose teams snap couplings, and chalked load plans vanish under the scuff of boots. The first strikes roll, then the second, and by midday, the count of sorties, launches, recoveries, respots, and launches again has crossed numbers that once existed only on staff officers' paper. On some days, more than 1,000 carrier aircraft lift into the sky from task force flight decks, and the targets under that air umbrella are no longer just islands but entire regions. For a voiceover, you don't need to say, "I told you so," out loud. You let the cut do the work. Start with a tight shot of Yamamoto's face in a pre-war photograph. Glasses, measured expression, then dissolve into the panning blur of a deck run as a Hellcat dives into the wind. The contrast is the argument. Yamamoto's core insight. America's war is an industrial problem, has arrived at scale. But the script can't just marvel at mass. We need to explain how the mass came to be. That means beginning not with battles, but with budgets, bunkers, and training syllabi. Not with aces, but with pipelines. The Imperial Japanese Navy goes to war with a superb, exquisitely trained cadre of naval aviators. The training curve is long and hard. The product is elite, but it is not elastic. The United States starts slower, stumbles in 1942, then fixes the machinery, pilot schools, carrier production, ordnance throughput, radar, fighter direction, deck choreography, and the ships behind the ships, the oilers and repair docks that keep the tempo from sagging. By 1944, the weight of that machine forces a new kind of war. The question is no longer who has the better pilot, but who can put a complete air plan over the target at dawn and again at noon, every day for a week. Yamamoto's own career angle gives us our first through line. He sees the coming of the carrier age early, but he has been shaped by big gun ships as well. He is not naive about risk. He is the architect of Midway's operational design because he believes surprise and concentration can cut the math down to size. It almost works until it doesn't. After Midway, Japan does not merely lose 4 carriers. It loses the most irreplaceable element in war, the practiced teams who make complex things look simple. A carrier air group is a living organism. Pilots, deck crews, ordnance men, plane captains, fighter directors, maintenance chiefs, whose craft is measured in fractions of minutes and tens of feet. Replace the aircraft, and you still have not replaced the organism. The American system, by contrast, spends the next 18 months building organisms by the dozen. That's the drama you want to stage in the listener's head as you say, calmly. Then, 1,000 carrier planes arrived in a day. It is not hyperbole. It is a statistical portrait of a fleet that learned to behave like a factory. One carrier group launches pre-dawn fighter sweeps to clear the air. A second group strike follows with bombers and torpedo planes. A third group holds a reserve, launches a midday follow-up, and keeps a combat air patrol overhead thick enough to look like a rolling overcast to the men on the ground. Behind them all, the replenishment group is already turning in from the horizon, fuel hoses strung like arteries, ammunition barges ready to pump the next day's thunder into lockers. This isn't just power, it's schedule. Rewind a moment and put yourself in 1941. Japan's strategic file folders are neat and well argued, but the baseline constraints are merciless. Domestic oil, mostly imported. Bauxite and other inputs for aluminum, imported. Shipyard capacity, skilled, yes. Limitless, no. The United States, by contrast, sits on a continent-sized magazine of resources. It can train pilots, build carriers, and still raise new armies. Yamamoto knows the ledger lines. His strategy is psychological, because the pure material balance is a cliff. That's the meaning behind the famous 6-month window. Inflict shocks so large that politics follows fear. Pearl Harbor is the first shock. A drive toward Australia through New Guinea is the second. Seizing the Central Pacific choke points to create a defensive perimeter is the third. Everything after that is contingency planning for a war he privately hopes he will not have to fight to the end. What upends that plan is not a single American victory, but a rolling solution to many small problems. The United States rebuilds carrier strength not with 1 or 2 hulls, but with a class, repeated, standardized, and improved. It pairs those big decks with light carriers converted from cruiser hulls to boost fighter numbers. It solves the night landing problem with better procedures and training. It reduces operational risk with radar and fighter direction. It makes the deck itself into an assembly line by adopting deck parks and tighter spotting. It keeps the whole contraption running with a fleet train that can refuel and rearm at sea. Each of those lines in a logistics memo turns, by 1944, into a practical truth. If the sea is calm enough to fly, the carriers can generate sorties in staggering volume. That is the hinge on which the story turns, and it frames the title with honest weight. Yamamoto knew the math. He knew because he had walked American factory floors, and he had read enough histories to know what happens when a continental economy gets angry. He hoped that shock and diplomacy would cap the war before that happened, but the war outran negotiation. By the time the U.S. Fast Carrier Task Force reaches full stride, the question, can Japan handle 1 or 2 enemy carriers, has been replaced by a reality that looks like multiple air forces at sea. 6, 8, sometimes more big decks together with a constellation of light carriers in company. On those days, the sum of the strike packages, not just fighters and bombers, but also recon, anti-submarine patrols, and relentless combat air patrol, tops 1,000 aircraft cycles. That is what industry at sea looks like. It is not a metaphor, it is a launch list. From the Japanese side of the scope, the experience is surreal. A radar station at the edge of a defended island reports multiple inbound groups, different altitudes, different bearings, pulsing in waves. Fighter controllers attempt to vector interceptors, but fuel is tight. The best pilots have been lost, and the climb rates on many late war types suffer under poor fuel and hurried maintenance. Anti-aircraft gunners open up with everything they have, but even good shooting only thins one wave, and the next is minutes behind it. The attack feels not like a single punch, but like trying to stand in front of a tide. That is the moment when the arithmetic stops being a prediction and becomes the view out a bunker slit. Yamamoto will not live to see it at its peak, but he would recognize it for what it is and for what it means. The purpose of this opening block is not to declare anyone's genius with hindsight. It's to set up the listener to understand that what comes next, those big named raids, the Turkey Shoot, the long reach to Formosa and Okinawa, the daylight sweeps over home waters, are not disconnected spectacles. They are the flowering of a system Yamamoto feared and tried to beat on time, not on tonnage. So, we'll now take the viewer by the hand and walk through the pre-war calculus that made him cautious, the American corrections that turned stumbles into doctrine, and the lived mechanics of a 1,000-plane day, a clock-driven storm, built not out of adjectives, but out of hangar doors that slide on time, bomb carts that arrive on time, and pilots who launch, land, and launch again, because the plan says they must, and the deck crew makes it possible. When we return, we'll zoom in on the numbers before the thunder, what Japan brought to the table in 1941, what it lacked, and why even the most brilliant operational gambles could not escape the slope of the curve. The Pacific War did not begin with bombs. It began with balance sheets. In Tokyo, naval planners knew exactly how many carriers they had: 6 fleet carriers, each carrying around 70 aircraft, plus a handful of smaller decks. They knew how many new ships could be laid down in a year, maybe 1 or 2 of real striking value. They knew how many elite aviators were in the ready pool, roughly 1,000, trained by a brutal system that weeded out almost everyone. And above all, they knew where their oil came from. Japan had no Texas, no Pennsylvania wells, no Caspian fields. It bought its oil, 80% of it, from the United States before relations collapsed. When Washington's embargo froze exports in mid-1941, the countdown clock began. The empire had reserves for perhaps 18 months of high-tempo war. After that, the tanks would run dry. Yamamoto was a realist, and his realism made him unpopular. He had studied in Boston, played poker in smoky back rooms, watched the churn of Detroit's assembly lines. He had crossed the continent by rail and understood its scale in his bones. In smoky meetings back in Tokyo, he warned the Army's hardliners. If war came, he could run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, the tide would turn. He didn't dress the warning up. He said flatly, "I shall run wild for the first 6 months, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." He knew that arithmetic, once it woke up, would erase any tactical edge. But Japan's admirals and generals were not all realists. Many still thought of war as a contest of spirit. They pointed to the skill of Japanese pilots, the quality of ships like the Akagi and Kaga, the elite gunnery of cruisers and battleships. They believed that Western decadence would fold before Asian resolve. Yamamoto had seen too much of the other side to share that view. He knew that the United States was not a paper giant. He had seen Chicago stockyards and New York skyscrapers. He had ridden roads that stretched farther than Honshu itself. He argued not for surrender, but for prudence. If war must come, then strike early, hit hard, and force Washington to negotiate before the machine could spin up. In late 1941, Japan's training pipeline still looked formidable. Naval aviators trained for years, sometimes as long as 7, in a system designed to produce a handful of the best. It worked. Japan's carrier pilots at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea were the sharpest in the world, but the system could not scale. Every pilot lost in combat represented years of investment, and the schools could not replace them quickly. America's system was the opposite. Shorter courses, more aircraft, more instructors, a pipeline designed not to polish gems but to mass-produce diamonds of good enough clarity. At first, this showed. In early 1942, American squadrons often looked green, their skills uneven, their tactics rough, but the flow kept coming. By 1943, thousands of new pilots poured out of the schools each year. By 1944, American decks were crowded, while Japan's were increasingly empty. Fuel was worse. Japanese carriers, cruisers, and destroyers were marvels of naval engineering, but their tanks guzzled oil that had to be imported from the Dutch East Indies or seized by force. Every sortie burned irreplaceable reserves. Training flights were cut back to save fuel. By contrast, American pilots could fly almost endlessly. California, Texas, Oklahoma. Fields of black gold fed not only the home front, but also tankers that kept the fleet running. An Essex-class carrier group at sea consumed oil on a scale that would cripple Japan in weeks. For America, it was an operating expense. Even shipyards told the same story. Japanese yards could craft fine vessels, but they worked in small numbers. An Essex-class carrier took about 2 years to build, and the United States ordered 24 of them. Some were delayed, some arrived late, but by 1944, the horizon was lined with new decks. Alongside them came the smaller Independence-class light carriers. 9 of them rushed from cruiser hulls. No matter how fast Japan worked, it could not outbuild that tide. Yamamoto tallied these realities with a gambler's cool eye. He knew what they meant. A short, shocking war was the only path to survival. That is why Pearl Harbor was not madness, but logic. Desperate, brutal logic. Strike the Pacific Fleet, seize a perimeter, dig in, and hope the Americans lacked the will to grind across the ocean. Japan's plan was to trade space for time, to stretch America's logistics, to make every island a fortress that bled blood and fuel. If Washington tired, Tokyo might bargain from strength. If Washington pressed, the math would decide. That was the backdrop against which Yamamoto warned his countrymen. He did not fear American courage. He feared American production. He feared the arithmetic of oil tankers, pilot schools, and shipyards. He had no illusions about what would happen if the United States chose to fight to the end. And when, in 1944 and 1945, the Pacific sky filled with hundreds upon hundreds of carrier aircraft, his grim forecast took form. The math had arrived, and it flew on wings. In 1942, America was still reeling. The wreckage of Pearl Harbor smoldered, the Philippines had fallen, and the Japanese flag flew over Wake and Guam. American carriers fought desperate holding actions at Coral Sea and Midway, and victory at Midway was as fragile as it was miraculous. 4 Japanese carriers went down, but the United States had no reserves to match. The Essex-class carriers were still in the yards, their steel skeletons rising but their decks bare. For a year, the Pacific War teetered on a knife's edge, but behind that knife edge, the machine was spinning up. In San Diego, Corpus Christi, and Pensacola, pilot schools expanded like small cities. By the end of 1942, the Navy was turning out more than 2,000 new aviators a month. Each man trained not for years, but for months, drilled on basic flying, navigation, and gunnery. They were not the elite, finely polished gems of Japan's naval air service, but they were good enough, and they came in waves. By 1943, America had trained more pilots in a single year than Japan had produced in 2 decades. The Essex-class carriers themselves were the embodiment of arithmetic. Authorized before the war, accelerated after Pearl Harbor, they rolled from slips like clockwork. The first, USS Essex, commissioned in December 1942. By the end of 1943, half a dozen were at sea. By mid-1945, 24 had been launched. Each carried nearly 100 aircraft. Hellcats, Helldivers, Avengers, and each came with radar, air search sets, combat information centers, and the deck space to run launch cycles with industrial precision. Alongside them came the Independence-class light carriers, smaller, faster, converted from cruiser hulls. They could not carry as much, but they multiplied the number of flight decks at sea. Together, they gave America what Yamamoto had feared most: scale. Scale did not just mean ships. It meant rhythm. Carrier warfare was about tempo. Launch, strike, recover, rearm, launch again. Japanese carriers could do it well, but fuel, pilot shortages, and maintenance gaps slowed the cycle. American carriers by 1943 were learning how to keep the tempo up. Deck parks allowed aircraft to be staged and spotted quickly. Bomb-handling crews worked like factory lines, hoisting and fusing ordnance with speed that shaved minutes from the turnaround. Fighter direction officers, working with radar, vectored combat air patrols efficiently, preserving fuel and preventing waste. Each tweak was small, but together they turned a complex choreography into a system that could operate at scale. Behind the carriers came the floating cities, service squadrons, repair ships, oilers, ammunition tenders, hospital ships, assembled at anchorages like Pearl, Espiritu Santo, and later Ulithi. Floating dry docks could swallow destroyers and even cruisers. Oilers pumped fuel at sea, a miracle of hoses and couplings that let the fleet keep steaming without returning home. It meant that by 1944, the American fleet could move across the Pacific like a rolling factory, never stopping, never running dry. The Japanese, tied to land bases and fragile supply lines, could not match it. Pilots noticed the difference first. By late 1943, replacement aircraft and crews were flowing forward faster than losses. A squadron that lost half its men in the Solomons could be rebuilt in weeks. Training emphasized gunnery and teamwork, and the new F-6F Hellcat, rugged and forgiving, gave green pilots a fighting chance. On the other side, Japanese squadrons flew veterans into the ground, their replacements thin, their aircraft fewer and often older. It was not that Japanese courage had dimmed, it was that courage could not refill fuel tanks or extend production lines. The result was visible in operations like the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaigns. In late 1943, American carriers hit Tarawa and Kwajalein. The strikes were not yet the 1,000-plane avalanches of 1944, but they were coordinated, heavy, and repeated. Radar picked up enemy raids, fighter direction vectored intercepts, and deck cycles kept the strikes rolling. For the first time, the math Yamamoto feared was becoming visible. Japan could match brilliance with brilliance, courage with courage, but it could not match tempo with tempo. The United States was learning how to fight not as individual ships, but as a fleet-sized machine. That was the hinge. By the end of 1943, the United States had turned stumbles into doctrine, training into throughput, and production into presence. The war was no longer about who had the sharper edge in 1941. It was about who could keep sharpening the blade after every strike. And in that contest, the United States was already winning. A carrier's power was not in its steel hull or its length of deck. It was in the rhythm of its deck cycle. Launch, recover, rearm, refuel, relaunch. The heartbeat of naval aviation. Get it right, and a task force could throw hundreds of planes into the air before the enemy knew what hit them. Get it wrong, and the deck jammed, the cycle broke, and the strike faltered. By 1943, the U.S. Navy had begun to turn this rhythm into a kind of industrial choreography. It started before dawn. On the black deck of an Essex-class, crewmen wheeled Avengers and Hellcats into position. Bombs rolled on dollies, their steel skins sweating in the humid night air. Fuel hoses hissed, filling tanks with 100-octane avgas. The deck smelled of oil, sweat, and salt. Pilots crouched in briefing rooms, studying target photos under red lights, memorizing bearings and altitudes. Below decks, Ordnance men fused bombs, careful hands twisting the arming vanes. By first light, the ship was alive, a hive of motion guided by a clock no one could see but everyone could feel. The first launch was always the heaviest lift. Planes crowded the deck, chalked and chained in long lines. Signal officers waved their paddles. The deck tilted into the wind, and one by one, fighters and bombers roared down the planks and lifted into the dawn. The launch cycle could last 40 minutes, sometimes more, as squadron after squadron clawed into the air. By the time the last bomber lifted, the first fighters were already circling overhead, their fuel clocks ticking. Timing was everything. The entire strike package had to assemble, climb, and then head in together. Too fast, and fighters ran out of gas. Too slow, and bombers straggled alone. Once the strike was gone, the deck did not rest. Planes returning from earlier sweeps had to be recovered. Landing signals flashed, paddles waved, arresting wires stretched taut. A good landing was quick. A bad one could block the deck for minutes that felt like hours. Crews dashed forward, folding wings, pushing planes clear. Maintenance teams checked engines. Ordnance crews swapped spent racks for fresh bombs. The deck park filled and emptied again. Each carrier was its own assembly line, and in a task force of 10 or more, the cycles staggered and overlapped so that the sky above the fleet never went empty. Japan had mastered precision, but America mastered repetition. Japanese carriers trained to perfection for single strikes, devastating when they landed. But their cycles were slow, their replacement planes few, their fuel limited. American carriers built cycles like clockwork. Hellcats rose for fighter sweeps, Avengers followed with torpedoes, Helldivers with bombs, then another cycle, and another. By the end of a day, a task force could launch 15, 20, sometimes more separate strikes, each coordinated across decks. Add the numbers together, and the tally climbed past 1,000 sorties in a single day. The key was not only pilots and planes, but the men in oil-stained jerseys who never left the deck, plane captains who knew their aircraft's quirks better than the pilots did, ordnance men who could load a 1,000-pound bomb in under 3 minutes, fuel crews who worked with cigarettes hanging from their lips, trusting luck as much as procedure, fighter directors in combat information centers, staring at green radar screens, vectoring squadrons with calm voices even as plots multiplied. The whole system worked because every man knew his part, and the parts meshed like gears. To an outsider, it looked like chaos. To the men who lived it, it was a machine, a living machine made of steel, sweat, and fuel. And when 10, 12, 15 carriers moved in concert, that machine did what Yamamoto had feared. It multiplied force beyond reason. One deck might launch 30 bombers. 10 decks could launch 300. Launch again and again, and by sundown you had emptied 1,000 bomb bays over enemy waters. It was not a miracle, it was the math. From the Japanese side, the effect was numbing. Radar stations reported one inbound raid, then another, until the board was covered with tracks. Fighters scrambled, ammunition belts slammed home, but every interception drained fuel and blood. Guns blazed, shells arced, but each wave only gave way to the next. For the defenders, it felt endless. For the Americans, it was the cycle, perfected, repeated, scaled until it became something new, the arithmetic of the sky. By 1944, the tide was not just turning, it was rolling like a storm surge. The machine Yamamoto had feared was no longer theoretical. It had mass, rhythm, and reach. American carriers no longer sailed cautiously in 2s or 3s. They gathered in great clusters. Task Force 58, the Fast Carrier Task Force, an armada of steel and flight decks, each one pulsing with its own cycle, each feeding into a hole that seemed unstoppable. The Japanese called them Kido Butai once. the Mobile Strike Force. Now, the title belonged to the Americans. The proof came first at Truk, once called the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The lagoon was the forward base of Japan's combined fleet, ringed by islands bristling with airfields. In February 1944, Task Force 58 swept in with 9 carriers, 5 battleships, and a cloud of cruisers and destroyers. For 2 days, the sky above Truk seethed with American aircraft. Strikes came at dawn, mid-morning, noon, and dusk. Fighters strafed runways, dive bombers punched holes in hangars, torpedo planes hunted shipping in the lagoon. By the time the raid ended, more than 250 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed, dozens of ships sunk or wrecked, and Truk's reputation as a fortress lay in smoking ruins. It was a rehearsal for the 1,000-plane days to come, a demonstration of what happened when deck cycles were multiplied by numbers. A place once whispered about in fear had been neutralized in 48 hours. Next came the Marshalls, then the Marianas. In June 1944, the invasion of Saipan forced Japan into a decision it had long delayed. The combined fleet could not sit idle while American troops took soil that was technically part of the Japanese home perimeter. The carriers had to sail. They came out in force. 9 carriers, 500 aircraft, the last desperate throw of a dice that Yamamoto himself would never see. At sea, the U.S. brought 15 carriers and nearly 1,000 planes. The imbalance was not just in numbers. It was in training, fuel, and tempo. The battle that followed is remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese pilots, once the sharpest blades in naval aviation, had been worn down by attrition. Fuel shortages had crippled their training. Many of the young men in cockpits had fewer than 100 flight hours. They flew outdated aircraft on poor fuel against Hellcats, flown by pilots trained in a system that produced not brilliance, but competence in mass. The result was slaughter. On June 19th alone, more than 300 Japanese aircraft fell from the sky. American losses were a fraction. It was like shooting turkeys, one pilot said grimly, the nickname sticking. For the Japanese, it was not a battle, but a catastrophe. The air groups were gutted. Carriers returned to port as empty shells, decks without teeth. The arithmetic was now visible even to those who had once believed in spirit over steel. Japan could not replace the losses. It had no fuel for new training, no seasoned instructors left to shape recruits, no time to rebuild the cadre destroyed over the Solomons and the Marshalls. Every sortie burned reserves that would never return. Meanwhile, American carriers launched and recovered in endless rhythm, their decks crowded with spare aircraft, their air groups reinforced even in mid-campaign. Pilots spoke of landing in the evening, eating dinner, and then hearing that fresh aircraft and men had arrived by transport, ready to fly the next morning. For Japan, such replenishment was impossible. The math was killing them by inches. The Marianas campaign showed what Yamamoto had feared all along. It was not bravery that decided battles now, but throughput. It was not who could fly higher or shoot straighter, but who could put more planes over the target again and again. By the end of the summer, the Americans were not just winning battles. They were erasing Japan's ability to fight them at all. The carrier force that had stunned the world at Pearl Harbor was gone. In its place were hulls without air groups, ships without fuel, pilots without training. The war had become an equation, and the solution was written in the contrails of 1,000 planes darkening the Pacific sky. The true miracle of 1944 was not just what happened in the air, but what kept happening after the strikes ended. A carrier could throw 100 planes into the sky, but without fuel, bombs, and repair crews, that cycle would grind to a halt. Japan's admirals knew this. Their carriers had to retreat after big operations, returning to home waters for repairs and resupply. Every voyage burned precious oil. Every replacement sortie drained a pilot pool that could not be refilled. It was an unsustainable rhythm. America solved this problem in a way that stunned the enemy and even surprised its own officers. It built a mobile city at sea. At the heart of this city was Ulithi Atoll, a speck in the Carolines. From the air it looked like nothing, a ring of coral and lagoon. But by late 1944, Ulithi had become the largest naval base in the world. Anchorages stretched to the horizon, filled with carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and hundreds of auxiliaries. Floating dry docks rose from the lagoon like steel mountains. Repair ships bristled with cranes, welding torches glowing through the night. Oilers lined up like beads on a string, pumping black fuel into the veins of the fleet. Ammunition ships disgorged endless crates of bombs, rockets, and shells. And all of it came forward, not backward. The innovation that made this possible was underway replenishment. Before the war, navies assumed fleets would need to retreat to bases for resupply. But the U.S. Navy's service squadrons changed that. They brought the base to the fleet. Oilers, ammunition ships, and supply vessels steamed in company with the task force, rendezvousing in mid-ocean. Hoses snaked across the swells. Fuel flowed while carriers held course at 12 knots, and bombs moved from one deck to another even as the sea rolled. It was dangerous work. A single spark could ignite an inferno. A snapped line could kill a man instantly. But it meant that the fleet never had to go home. It meant that 1,000-plane day could be followed by another and another, until the enemy simply broke. Floating dry docks were another quiet miracle. When a destroyer's hull was torn by a kamikaze or a carrier's screws fouled, it no longer had to limp back to Pearl Harbor or San Francisco. It could steam 100 miles to Ulithi, slide into a dry dock the size of a battleship, and emerge repaired in weeks, sometimes days. The speed was astonishing. A ship that would have been lost to months of absence returned to the line in time for the next offensive. Japan, by contrast, had no equivalent. Damage meant retreat, and retreat meant absence. Even medicine was mobile. Hospital ships with white hulls and green crosses anchored among the fleet, treating thousands of casualties on the spot. Evacuation lines ran smoothly from frontline decks to surgical wards afloat. Men who would have died in earlier wars lived, returned, and in some cases even flew again. For morale, it was priceless. For manpower, it was arithmetic. Every man saved was one less replacement needed. One more hand to keep the cycle running. From Yamamoto's perspective, had he lived to see it, this was the nightmare. It was not just American courage, not just American steel. It was the ability to turn the ocean itself into an assembly line. Japan could prepare for a raid, could brace for one massive strike. But how do you brace for a fleet that never stops? For planes that come at dawn, noon, and dusk, and then again the next day, without pause? Logistics was not a backdrop. It was the war. The 1,000-plane days were not isolated spectacles. They were made possible because every link, oilers, dry docks, service squadrons, hospital ships, worked as intended. It was the mathematics of sustainment. And it was the one arena where Japan could not hope to compete. Its oilers were few, its bases vulnerable, its convoys shredded by submarines. Its carriers, when damaged, limped home on dwindling fuel, sometimes never to return. America's carriers fought, repaired, replenished, and fought again, in a rhythm that was both mechanical and relentless. In the end, the decisive advantage was not in a cockpit or on a flight deck. It was in the black fuel snaking through a hose in the middle of the Pacific, in the sparks of welders at midnight in Ulithi, in the boxes of bombs stacked higher than a man on the decks of an ammunition ship. That was the arithmetic Yamamoto knew, but could not stop. The arithmetic of logistics. Picture the morning sky over the Philippine Sea in 1944. The horizon glows faintly, streaked with red, as the first light of dawn touches the water. On the flight deck of an Essex-class carrier, the scene is controlled chaos. Aircraft stand wingtip to wingtip, their cowlings painted with white numbers, their fuselages dark with dew. Men in colored jerseys move quickly but precisely, yellow shirts directing traffic with outstretched arms, red shirts hauling bombs on wheeled carts, purple shirts topping off tanks with avgas. A smell hangs heavy: gasoline, oil, sweat, and salt spray. Beneath it all hums the anticipation of flight. At 0500, the loudspeakers crackle. Pilots hurry from ready rooms, helmets tucked under arms, faces pale in the dim light. In briefing huts, they've studied targets, bearings, altitudes. Now, it's down to instinct and routine. They climb ladders, strap into cockpits, run hands across switches. Mechanics stand by with chalks in hand. On the bridge, the air officer checks the clock. It's time. Engines cough, then roar. Blue-gray Hellcats, Helldivers, and Avengers rev in unison, their propellers throwing salt mist back across the deck. The carrier turns into the wind, bow rising and falling with the swells. On the deck edge, the launch officer drops his flag. One by one, planes leap forward, wheels rattling, then lift clear. Each launch takes seconds. The cycle lasts almost an hour. When the last bomber claws into the sky, more than 100 aircraft circle overhead, climbing in great wheels until the strike package is formed. Over the fleet, the sky is already crowded. Another carrier has launched her first wave. Still more are spotting aircraft for the next. A task force of 12 carriers means waves overlap. From horizon to horizon, black dots circle upward, then stream east toward the enemy. Below, the sea boils with escorts and destroyers, their wakes carving white lines across the blue. To a man on deck, it feels like watching a continent lift into the air. For the Japanese radar operator on an island station hundreds of miles away, it feels like a nightmare. The green scope fills with contacts. One raid, then two, then five, stacked in altitudes, bearing down like a tide. Reports rush over field telephones. Enemy aircraft inbound, hundreds strong. Pilots scramble, engines stutter to life. But fuel is low, and many men in cockpits have barely completed training. The scale is incomprehensible. In 1942, a large raid might mean 80 planes. Now, the count is measured in hundreds, and the next wave is minutes behind the first. Back over the fleet, the machine does not stop. Even as one wave disappears into the east, crews are spotting the next strike. Bombs roll out of magazines, fuses twist into place, hoses hiss with more fuel. Pilots grab coffee, debrief quickly, and prepare for another sortie. Landing signal officers guide returning planes in, their paddles flashing left or right. A Hellcat slams down, hook catching a wire with a jolt, then is shoved aside, wings folding as another lines up behind it. The deck park fills, engines are cut, and ground crews swarm. The noise never ends. Engines, arresting cables, the bark of orders, the boom of catapults. Midday brings another cycle. By now, hundreds of American aircraft are over enemy airfields, harbors, and convoys. Dive bombers roll into near-vertical plunges, bombs shrieking downward. Torpedo planes skim low, their weapons dropping into foaming wakes. Fighters rake runways, shredding parked planes and strafing barracks. Smoke boils upward, oil fires spreading black scars across the landscape. Japanese anti-aircraft guns roar, tracers stitching the sky, but even accurate fire can only cut into one wave before the next arrives. The defenders are overwhelmed. The rhythm of the strike feels endless. Attack, regroup, attack again. As the sun dips west, the carriers are still at it. Strike groups return in ragged formation, holes in wings, smoke trailing from engines. Rescue destroyers pull downed pilots from the sea. On the decks, the cycle continues. Planes land, fold wings, refuel, reload, and launch again. By dusk, some carriers have launched and recovered more than 200 sorties. Multiply that by a dozen decks, and the tally is staggering. Over 1,000 launches in a single day, fighters, bombers, patrols, and rescues. The sky filled and refilled until the defenders simply collapsed. For the Americans, it feels less like victory than like work. Every man is exhausted, covered in oil and sweat, ears ringing from hours of noise. But the system holds. The deck cycle is intact. The math has been proven again. Industry and rhythm can turn steel hulls into factories of war, each one producing shock by the hour. And for the Japanese who survived the day, the memory is indelible. One pilot later said it was not like fighting men at all. It was like standing against a storm. You could shoot down a Hellcat, you could hit a bomber, but you could not stop the sky. It simply kept coming. That was the 1,000-plane day, when Isoroku Yamamoto warned Japan's leaders about the dangers of war with the United States. He was not guessing. He was counting. He counted oil barrels, shipyard slips, steel tonnage, pilot training hours. He had seen the numbers in Boston and Chicago, in New York and Detroit. He knew how fast America could build and how ruthlessly it could replace what was lost. He told colleagues in 1940 and 1941 that he could give them victories in the first 6 months, but after that, he promised nothing. And in 1944, his prophecy had come true. What Yamamoto understood was scale. Japan could build fine ships, the Yamato, the Shokaku, the Zukaku. It could train extraordinary pilots, men who could thread torpedoes into narrow channels at Pearl Harbor and score bomb hits from high dives in the Coral Sea. But what Japan could not do was scale those strengths. Each carrier sunk was years of effort gone. Each ace lost was irreplaceable. Each gallon of oil burned was a gallon gone forever. There was no margin for error. America, by contrast, had margins so wide they looked like a chasm. When carriers were sunk at Coral Sea or Midway, more were already sliding down the ways. When pilots were killed over Guadalcanal, thousands more were in flight schools. When fuel was burned on a sortie, tankers pumped more into waiting oilers at sea. By 1944, the difference was not theoretical. It was everywhere. Japanese carriers still sailed, but many without full air groups. Pilots often flew with barely 100 hours of training. Aircraft fuel was rationed, leaving squadrons unable to practice. Mechanics cannibalized planes for parts, cutting down air strength even before a mission began. And yet, the orders still came. Sail, fight, hold the line. Yamamoto had said a long war was unwinnable, and now the Navy he had once led was watching that prediction unfold. Even morale reflected the math. American pilots rotated out after tours, replaced by fresh men with new aircraft. Japanese pilots flew until they were dead, exhausted, or grounded by wounds. American carriers returned damaged and were repaired in weeks at Ulithi. Japanese carriers limped home and sometimes never returned. American service squadrons brought ice cream and mail to the fleet in mid-ocean. Japanese crews survived on dwindling rice and pickled vegetables. The contrast was so stark it shocked even the men who lived it. One Japanese officer after the war said, "We did not lose to men. We lost to factories." He was echoing what Yamamoto had tried to say years before. But even Yamamoto could not foresee how utterly the arithmetic would overwhelm Japan. He understood that America could outbuild his nation. He may not have imagined that one day, more than 1,000 planes would take off from carriers in a single day, striking again and again, never pausing, never stopping. That was not just industry. That was industry turned into rhythm, into doctrine, into a weapon that fought as predictably and relentlessly as the tide. Japan had gambled that spirit and brilliance could offset numbers, and for 6 months maybe a year, it almost looked true. Pearl Harbor, the Indian Ocean raids, the advance to the Solomons, they were dazzling. But once the United States absorbed the blows and brought its factories to bear, the balance became impossible. Courage could not refill tanks. Training could not be compressed into weeks. Battleships and carriers could not be conjured from empty slips. The math Yamamoto knew had arrived, and it crushed Japan as surely as any bomb or torpedo. Numbers alone don't tell the story. They explain why fleets rose and fell, but they do not capture what it felt like to live inside that storm. The 1,000-plane days were not just equations on a chalkboard. They were sweat on the flight deck, oil on bare hands, fear in the chest of a boy in a cockpit. To understand Yamamoto's prophecy fulfilled, you have to hear the human voices beneath the roar of engines. On the American side, an ordnance crewman remembered the routine of loading bombs until his muscles went numb. He described the carrier's hangar deck as a factory floor where the whistle never blew. Crates of 500-pounders arrived by endless elevator runs. Men in red jerseys muscled them onto dollies, slid them beneath Avengers and Helldivers, cranked hoists, and bolted them into place. He said the rhythm was so constant that men forgot at the day of the week. Time was measured by launches and recoveries. Yet there was pride, too. Each weapon loaded meant another strike, another blow that would shorten the war. He recalled standing back, grease on his arms, watching the bombers roll forward into the wind and thinking, "This is America's factory at sea, and I'm one of the workers." For the pilots, the human side was equal parts terror and routine. A young Hellcat pilot described his first strike in 1944. He wrote that he had been more afraid of the deck than the enemy, the speed of takeoff, the sheer drop of the sea just beyond the bow. Once airborne, he said, training took over. The formation wheeled together, the horizon filled with friendly wings, and for a moment the fear was swallowed by awe. It was like flying in a storm made of men, he said. But by the time he landed, nerves returned. The landing signal officer's paddles waved, the deck loomed, the hook slammed down, and he was alive. Then came the knowledge that he would do it again in 2 hours. For the Japanese, the human side was darker. A radar operator on Guam recalled the moment the screen filled with contacts during a U.S. carrier raid. He said the scope went from clear to solid green in minutes, tracks crowding until he could no longer distinguish them. He remembered calling out bearings faster than his officer could record them, then hearing the roar of engines above. It was like the sky itself had turned against us, he said later. For him, the math was not numbers on paper. It was the sensation of being buried under waves he could not count. Pilots, too, felt the weight. A young Japanese aviator, barely trained, recalled scrambling in a zero with only a handful of hours behind him. He admitted he was terrified not of dying, but of failing. He had been told he must protect the homeland, but when he climbed to meet the incoming raid, the sky was already filled with Hellcats, too many to count. He fired, twisted, tried to dive, but within minutes his aircraft was hit. He bailed out, was captured, and years later spoke of that day as the moment he knew the war was lost. It was not a battle, he said. It was a flood. Even those who never flew lived inside the arithmetic. On an American carrier, a cook recalled serving meals to men who came in with oil on their faces and hands, trembling from adrenaline. He said he could tell the tempo of the battle by the pace at which trays were cleared. At Truk, he remembered, men ate in silence, too tired to speak. In the Marianas, they returned laughing, exhilarated by the slaughter in the sky. He had not seen the air war directly, but he understood the rhythm. Feed the machine, keep it moving. On the Japanese side, sailors on carriers returned to port with empty decks. One later said it felt like sailing a ghost. The ships were intact, the paint still fresh, The lines still taut, but the heart was gone. There were no squadrons to fly, no crews to cheer. He said the silence was worse than battle. The ship was alive, but it had no soul. This was the human face of arithmetic. For America, it meant exhaustion, routine, and pride. Men turned into cogs of a vast, relentless machine that worked. For Japan, it meant dread, futility, and silence. Men trapped in a war that had outgrown their courage. Yamamoto's prophecy had become not just strategy, but lived experience. To those in the sky, on the deck, or in the bunkers below, the 1,000-plane days were not abstract. They were the taste of salt, the smell of fuel, the pounding in the chest that came with the realization the math had arrived, and it had a human face. When the dust settled, the Pacific no longer looked the same. The 1,000-plane days had broken more than fleets. They had broken an idea. The belief that Japan could outlast, outfight, or outspirit the United States. Yamamoto's warning that America's arithmetic was destiny had come true in the clearest possible way. The lesson lingered not just in Japanese memory, but in every navy that watched from afar. The fast carrier task force had proven that naval power was no longer about a single decisive clash between two battle lines. It was about tempo, about repetition, about the ability to launch one strike after another until the enemy was ground down. Battleships still fired their guns, but they were now escorts, guardians of the floating airfields. The real weight of the fleet was measured in squadrons, deck cycles, and replenishment schedules. The Pacific had been the laboratory, and by 1945 the experiment was complete. Carriers were the capital ships of the modern age. For Japan, the memory was bitter. Carriers that once embodied naval pride returned as empty holes. Pilots who had once ruled the skies wrote memoirs filled with regret, describing how they faced not men, but mathematics. Even decades later, Japanese officers spoke of the despair of watching wave after wave of aircraft arrive without pause. One called it fighting the ocean with bare hands. Another said, "We lost not to courage, but to production." Yamamoto had been right, but his realism had come too late to change the course of a nation bent on war. For the United States, the 1,000-plane days became legend. Veterans spoke of them not with triumph, but with awe. The sight of flight decks covered in wings, the roar of engines at dawn, the endless cycle of launch and recovery. They remembered the exhaustion, the grease, the fear, but also the knowledge that they were part of something larger than themselves. A machine that had turned a continent's industry into power at sea. It was a kind of democracy in action. Every man, from pilot to cook to ordnance handler, playing his part in a system that only worked if everyone worked together. The legacy reached far beyond 1945. When new wars loomed in Korea, Vietnam, and the Persian Gulf, carriers carried the weight. The lesson of the Pacific, that a mobile fleet, supplied at sea, could project power on a continental scale, became doctrine. Even nuclear weapons did not erase it. Every navy studied what had happened when Task Force 58 darkened the skies over the Marianas and the Philippines. Every admiral knew the phrase whispered about Yamamoto's warning. In the end, the math wins. But the legacy was not only strategic, it was human. The men who loaded bombs, who flew sorties, who guided planes in with paddles, carried the memory of those days into peacetime. They remembered not just the victories, but the faces, friends who did not return, enemies seen only as flashes in the sky, moments of terror and routine woven together. They remembered how the war felt like a tide, unstoppable, and how they had been part of it. And they remembered the strange truth that the most decisive factor in victory was not bravery alone, but the ability to repeat bravery endlessly, fueled by factories and oil fields thousands of miles away. That was Yamamoto's legacy too. He had not lived to see the 1,000-plane days, but he had predicted them. He knew that war with America was a gamble against numbers, and that no spirit could balance a ledger that vast. When those carriers filled the horizon and the sky roared with their squadrons, his warning became visible. The war ended not with one final duel, but with arithmetic made manifest. A storm of steel and wings that only a continent could summon. The story of those 1,000 planes in a day is not just about World War II. It is about what happens when numbers, industry, and will combine. It is about how foresight can be ignored, how warnings can be silenced, and how, in the end, the math writes the last line of history. Yamamoto knew it. The world learned it. And the Pacific sky, once filled with 1,000 engines, carried the lesson forever.